Welcome, guys, to yet another episode of Purpose is Trade. My name is Purpose Khan, and I will talk to you about global economics and how to make money from it. So, in this episode, I suggest I so the last few episodes, if you haven't watched already, I talked about the energy market in depth around the world. I promised I'll make a seven series playlist on energy finances around the world. I made three episodes so far. I'll take a break from that series. We'll get back to energy finances later on. But for now, I want to make a video on something a bit more interesting, which is basically first world versus second world versus third world, how these terms were coined. And yeah, so, when people talk about the first world, second world, third world, the image that comes into mind is first world are rich countries, second world are average, moderately rich, and then you have third worlders, which are poor countries. But if you go through the history of these terms, that's not how it originated. So these first, second, third world terms were coined during the Cold War, and they were actually used to label political alliances, not economic uh, classes. So during the Cold War, the first world countries were basically the Western countries, and the second world countries were the countries that were aligned with Soviet Union, the communist, and the third world countries were the countries that were non-aligned, that were not aligned with the Western world or the Soviet world. So Southeast Asia mainly, and a bit of most of Africa, and a bit of Middle East. And so that's where the term came from. So first, second, third world is basically those terms were coined to define different political alliances during the Cold War. And coincidentally, these different alliances had different economies. And so once the Cold War was over, the terms did not go away. The political alliances were no more there because the Soviet Union was dissolved. But the terms first world, second world, third world stayed because the countries, the alliances had unique economic differences when Soviet Union dissolved. And that's why now they're used to define basically rich countries versus poor countries. And so, yeah, basically, when these terms, first world, second world, third world, were coined during the Cold War, the non-aligned countries were called the third world and politically non-aligned, which was India and most of Southeast Asia, little bit of Middle East, and also most of Africa. And these countries also coincidentally had the weakest economies because most of these were part of the British Empire. We could get into whose fault it is for why these countries are poor. But let's not forget the fact that India was, during the 18th and 17th century, before the British came, India had 25% of global GDP. Okay. So India was not poor for throughout history. Okay. They became poor very recently since the British came and looked at the country, basically. Yeah. And I think so. I have friends who are born and raised in the so-called first world, and they talk about how the third world country people are barbaric, impolite, uncivil, smelling bad, and all that. And it's interesting because if you read history, you realize that it's basically history coming full circle. So when the British first came to India during the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, obviously India had 25% of the global GDP. It was a rich country, and the Mughal emperors, and there are records of this. The Mughal emperors used to keep diaries and notebooks, and they talked about the British diplomats that would come and visit them. and how the British diplomats would stink badly, and how the British diplomats' behavior was barbaric. It was only after British became rich through looting the colonies that they started behaving politely. And yeah, even in China, the Chinese emperor had records which showed that the British were basically labeled as the barbarics when they first came to China. And so yeah, it's the world going full circle in my opinion. So I think people needs to get off their high horses, especially people who grew up in the Western world, and really understand that just because someone might seem impolite and barbaric to you doesn't necessarily mean that because it's the saying, pride comes before fall. That's 100% true. That happened to the Mughal Empire. They were too proud of themselves. They didn't take the British threat seriously. That happened to the Chinese Empire. They were too proud of themselves. They didn't take the British threat seriously because they were just a bunch of barbarics. And look what ended. It took British uh, East India Company less than 200 years to loot the entire Asia resources and make themselves rich. And not even 200 years. I mean, so USA became independent from England towards the end of the 18th century, so around 1790s, 80s, something like that. And that's when Britain focused heavily on their income from India and Asia because they just lost a significant colony in North America. And that's when they focused on India, and that's when the British East India Company went hard and aggressive on the Asians to loot from them. So basically, it was around 100 years of looting. That's basically all it took for UK to make India one of the poorest countries and make Britain go from a barbaric country to one of the richest, polite societies. So, that's what I'm telling you. When my, Western friends, they talk about the so-called third world countries in such disdain, I tell them that, look, hey, it doesn't take very long. If you read history, and back then there was no internet, there was no technology. It was very slow. Information spread very slowly. So changes were slow. And even in that kind of environment, it took UK literally 100 years. So only the 19th century, after the lost USA, that's when they went hard to fight the Mughal Empire in India because that was their main source of income after that. So that was basically the 19th century. They looted seriously from India and Asia from China. And yeah, funny enough, in the 19th century when Opium Wars happened, America supported Britain in the Opium Wars against China because they wanted to also loot from China. And so it took literally 100 years for the British to go from a barbaric society of stinky sailors to the rich, polite, fancy, posh, upper elite, bourgeois Londoners, right? And then you had two world wars because they got too greedy, and then there were other European uh, colonial ambitionists, other European kings and queens who were like, "Where's our share of the pie? We also want to loot." They got greedy, they got envious of the Britain's success, and that's what led to the First and Second World War, in my opinion. I mean, the First World War was because of German Frederick ambition to create a colonial empire, and UK didn't want that. They didn't want to share the pie, and so greed, envy of all these kings and queens of Europe basically led to the First and Second World War. And yeah, since then, now we are close to 100 years. We are reaching almost 80 years since Second World War, 80 or 85 years. And look where you are right now. I mean, UK is one of the most broken, bankrupt country in the world with a bunch of lazy. I mean, I have British friends, but even they tell me that why they don't want to work because why bother? You can just live off, unemployment benefits and you know, everyone, like left, right, centrists, everyone talk about how Britain is broken. The economies, most of the assets are bought by US corporate. And yeah, it took less than 80 years for UK to go from, the sun never sets on the British Empire, the British flag, to now you're in 2024, and most of the citizens of your country are fleeing your country to tax havens in the Middle East, and most of your country is broke. They can't afford heat or electricity or food, basic stuff. And your recent prime minister was richer than your king. I mean, what more can you ask? I mean, the writing is on the wall at this point. I saw this recent report. Sorry, so let me just drink some tea. So yeah, I saw this recent report where they were talking about. So USA has, surprise, surprise, military bases in UK, and they were coming under attack from swarm of drone swarm, uh, that were apparently sent by Russia. And then UK had to send their military to protect US military bases in UK from an army of drones sent by Russia. I mean, just think of the chain of events that have to happen for UK to end up in that situation, right? Your government's broke, you have a $22 billion black hole in the budget, which is okay. But your own army is sent to protect another country's army, which is on your soil, from an attack by an enemy. I mean, and so I think, yeah, like, when people like Vladimir Putin says that UK is a vassal state of USA, I mean, they're not wrong, really, if you think about it. Uh, right, like events like this just remind the UK citizens that you know, they're basically a vassal state of USA. And I guess I want to bring the topic back to that first world, second world, third world. So first world countries are basically countries that were politically aligned during the Cold War with USA, and look where it got them. Most of them are now going to be bullied by USA for better trade benefits by Trump. And the Second World War countries were basically those coined as to be part of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and bunch of bit of Middle East. I mean, Eastern European countries are lost. They were enticed by the money of the European Union. They were basically bribed to join the European Union and the NATO project. But even most of them are now turning their backs on, because they realize they have fundamentally different views, very different views than most of Western European countries. So even they are now turning their backs on that, and they're also now uh, trying to switch alliance back to Russia. And then the third world countries, the so-called non-aligned countries during the Cold War, which happened to be the poorest countries during the Cold War. And then any poor country has since been labeled as third world. They are now the fastest growing countries. They are the countries that have the most number of immigrants sent to the first world, so-called first world. And they're basically now the only countries that are growing organically. And I talked about this in my previous video where, you can grow GDP two ways. You can artificially inflate your GDP numbers by pumping money, reserve currency money into the economy, and the other way is organically growing your GDP by just producing more goods. And these third world countries are actually growing their economy of organic manner, so which is sustainable. And yeah, like, I talked about the British example. It took them 100 years to go from a barbaric status to rich, polite Londoners. Literally took them 100 years. And now you're reaching close to 100 years status where these so-called third world countries are basically getting rich, unfortunately, of the backs of so-called first world countries, right? All the revenue that comes in from working in first world countries, it's sent to third world countries, right? And on top of that, all this innovation, people go to first world countries, learn something, come back, implement it in so-called third world countries, and yeah, I mean, it's the full circle of life, right? Like I'm not a big believer in. I think you get what you preach. I think that karma. It's I would say it is also part of nature. It's a cyclical way of life. Your society. If your society is poor, it'll do anything to become rich. And if your society is too rich, it'll become too lazy, and it'll basically be less competitive and then become collide into uh, poverty eventually. It happened to the Mughal Empire. It's happening to the British. It's happening to the Americans. That's a cyclical characteristic of nature. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, when people talk about third world, first world, and I think they don't understand where the term came from. It didn't come from an economic aspect. It came from a political perspective. And after the Cold War was over, the economic aspect stayed in the labeling of these countries. So I guess what's the significance of it, right? So if during the Cold War, I mean, if you're a country that was aligned with USS politics, you were labeled as a first world country. So under that political alliance, right now you're basically one of the biggest losers. I mean, Europe went bankrupt by buying expensive energy from USA in the last few years. UK is bought up by USA, no doubt. Canada is getting bullied left and right by USA, and Trump is not gonna help the situation. And so, being a first world country alliance is not helping you. If you're a second world country that was aligned with the Soviet Union, I mean, sure, there was some grief on how you were treated by Moscow, by Russia, and so you decide to leave, try a new partner, in this case, the European Union, and turned out your ex was better than your current partner, and now you're thinking about uh, returning to your ex, rekindling the relationship with Russia, and for the third world countries, non-aligned ones, they basically just minded their own business, focused on making money, focused on improving their education. And yeah, now they're growing the fastest in the world and no one can stop them. So yeah, I think when people needs to realign their mentality on whether it's a bad thing to be a non-aligned third world country or a second world country that was aligned with the Soviet Union, or a so-called first world country that's aligned with USA. I mean, I have nothing against USA, but if anyone is looking at what's happening right now in the world and thinks that being aligned with USA is a net benefit, then I would say, give me an example, and I'll see if I can agree with you. But I just don't see any niche examples of that. Yeah, I mean, forget Europe, forget Canada. South America, let's look at US's backyard, right? They basically made sure that South America never establishes its own sovereignty, and now they're dealing with the problems of that, the byproducts of migration because they wreck the societies. And let's look at Middle East, for example. They promised Saudi Arabia with military protection and Bahrain, Qatar, and all that. But when it comes to choosing sides, whether it was in the 1970s or right now, USA will always side with Israel over the Arab countries. And if that's, look, I have nothing against Israel. If USA wants to do that, they have all the right. But the Arab countries who have bought all this expensive equipments, military equipments from USA, and basically kept the US military industrial complex going as the biggest purchaser of these equipments. and in return they get, they're not even first customer. They're still not first in priority line. Israel is still in first in priority line, whether it is in the 70s or right now. I mean, yeah, I just don't see a situation where it has been good to be an ally of USA. Even Israel, let's talk about Israel. I personally believe Israel would have made more friends in the Middle East and around the world if they did not align so closely with USA. Because it's like, you know, when you're deeply aligned with USA, you are, even if it's not true, people might think of you as a puppet of the USA because that's how USA treated countries that were deeply aligned with them in the past. And I mean, there are pretty few examples like Europe, for example. Europe has destroyed its economy by sanctioning cheap Russian gas and oil just because USA said so. And I truly believe that Israel would have made more friends if they didn't ally so closely with the USA. And yeah, I just being a first world country aligned with USA has not really panned out for most of the countries around the world. Being a second world country has led to a lot of confusion, seeking out of new partners, feeling lost, especially of Eastern European countries, right? Countries like Iran and all that, right? And yeah, but now they're rethinking of realigning with Russia again. And just being a third world country and minding your own business, not being politically aligned, has basically helped to accelerate the growth rate of the third world countries. And we're talking about organic growth. We're not talking about a growth that's artificially inflated by pumping up more reserve currency money, right? So yeah, I just wanted to talk about this topic, how, where these terms came from and what it actually means and what the future might look like for this alliance. Look, the alliances are not going away anytime soon, right? Let's be honest, the non-aligned countries are likely to remain non-aligned. And the only difference is China was considered a second world country, which is aligned with the Soviet and the communists. But now China is probably a more dominant player. So they're probably trying to create a fourth alliance. So you have the alliances with USA, alliances of Russia in Eastern Europe, and then China is trying to build their own coalition of alliances in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and on you still have the non-aligned countries. So yeah, the world is now breaking up into another more alliances. And how will this pan out? We'll see. But what I can tell you for sure, the first world countries should get off their high horses and stop thinking of themselves as holier than thou, smelling the best, looking the best, and having the best behavior. Because I can tell you, and I have a lot of friends in the West, I can tell you this, which is that pride always comes before fall. And it happened to the Mughal Empire. They were very proud of themselves. And before you know it, the British colluded with the local mercenaries to take on and then bribe the Mughal Empire soldiers. And then the Mughal Empire basically, the soldiers turned on the empire, on the king. And yeah, everyone heard about the famous story of Sirajuddaulah. So yeah, so I'll just talk about that for a bit. So this was in Bengal and current day Bangladesh. It was in northern Bangladesh back then. It was called the Bengal Mughal Empire, and it was run by um Mughal king. But the British basically, before going to war against the Mughal king, they basically bribed a portion. They couldn't bribe the entire Mughal army. So they bribed just a significant portion of that army to go to battle with the Mughal emperor, but on the day of the battle to retreat. So what happened was the British declared war on the Mughal emperor of Bengal in current day Bangladesh. And at the day of the battle, the Mughal Empire had different regiments, different army branches, and the Britain army was able to bribe one of these branches. And on the day of the battle, that bribed branch of the Mughal army basically retreated. Okay, they didn't fight. And that left, I think, one of the flanks open to attack by the British. And yeah, that's what basically led to, I think, 10,000 or fewer British men routing up over 50,000 or even more Mughal soldiers. Because the biggest weakness of any army is not from what's outside. It's better to know the devil outside. The biggest weakness as an army comes from inside. And that's why treachery is always been regarded as the worst crime of all, being a traitor. And yeah, that's how the Mughal Empire fell. They're the biggest army, the most resources, but they, I don't know, they didn't treat one of their, uh, army regiments well. They were too proud of themselves as a ruler, and that army regiment basically sold themselves out to the British. And yeah, your biggest weakness is usually inside. It's not outside. Okay. Your biggest weakness will come from inside. It will not come from outside. And yeah, I think people needs to understand that. And they need to especially Western countries, they need to get off their high horses and realize that they might have the biggest army, they might have the most sophisticated technologies, but when it comes to fighting, if there's a part of your army that betrays you on the day of the battle, it will be more than impossible to recover from that betrayal. That's important. And yeah, I just want to talk about this. It's an interesting topic. I think a lot of changes are coming around the world in the next few decades. I think people should keep their eyes and ears open and yeah, get ready for changes coming. Who knows, you might be witnessing and living in one of the most defining periods of humankind. You might be lucky, you might be lucky to live in one of the most defining periods of humankind. So yeah, that's all it there is for today. In the next video, we'll get back into the energy markets. We'll talk more about how energy markets are financed in other places around the world. And yeah, that's it from today. See you next.